So this morning, what we're going to do is look at simply two ways that we use power in our lives and how Jesus invites us to do it differently. And I think this is still meaningful for us today, in part because one of the things we really despise or maybe even hate is when people misuse their power. As I've shared multiple times now, one of my favorite Christmas movies is It's a Wonderful Life, and the most painful part of that movie is when you see the forgetful uncle, fold up the money in the newspaper, and he foolishly gives it to the mean old Mr. Potter. And that's painful to watch because you know what's going to happen, which is Potter, when he finds out that he has this extra cash, he's not going to do anything to fix it, right? He's going to abuse the power that he has in that situation. But this scene in cinema is nothing like the frustration and anger that many of us have when we see misuse of power in the world. It's really frustrating when we hear stories, for example, of a politician who's on a legislative committee who then makes stock moves based on laws that they're enacting or revoking, and they're just making money directly off of their influence. That's frustrating. That makes us angry. We get angry when we hear stories of large organizations or corrupt lawyers who are bossing around smaller entities because they have more power than they can. It makes us angry when those who are in positions of trust, those who are in positions where they're supposed to protect vulnerable peoples, and they do the opposite. Those things make us angry. The challenge is there's this reality called the paradox of power. And the paradox of power says that for some reason, the good traits that often led a person to move up the ladder, to get into a position of power, those good traits often disappear when they actually get to power. That something happens to us when we have power that we once did not have. And so my hope for us this morning is to open our eyes to how this might be true in our own life and how Jesus again invites us to another way so that we don't become like the power-hungry people that so often frustrate us. So we're going to look at this text from Matthew 2, verses 1 through 18. And see in it two ways that power is abused, how Jesus used his power, and then two disciplines to protect us from power. I have no slides, so this is just Matthew 2. I'll read it to you. If you have a Bible, if you want to pull out your phone and open a Bible app, you're welcome to do that. It's Matthew 2, verses 1 through 18. So hear these words from the book that we love. I don't know why I have this clicker. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem, in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way. And the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more. So in this text, we see two ways that power is often abused, and that's through authority and knowledge. And the way that we see power abused through authority in our text is we see it in the person of King Herod. Herod was called King of the Jews. Now, he wasn't king of the people of Israel like David was king. He was appointed by Rome. He was basically the representative of Rome to overrule the area where the Jews lived. And so, of course, when he hears from these strangers from the east that there's been a new person that's supposed to be king of the Jews, he becomes very alarmed. And he sets out to work to destroy this new king. Now, his first act is he tells the Magi, he goes, find where this child is and relay it back to me. And this is really interesting for a couple of reasons. One is it shows us a sign when we're abusing our authority, when we're wanting to guard our authority, as we think we're above certain tasks, right? Because supposedly Herod is saying to them, hey, go and do this, and then I'll come and worship you. You search him out, and once you find him, then I'll come and pay homage. And instead, if he had any humility, he would just go himself. And ironically, if he had gone himself and he wanted to destroy the king, he could have. But his own arrogance prevented him from doing this. He thought he was powerful enough to do it later. And when the Magi don't return after finding the child, we see that Herod gets very angry. His intentions are laid bare. And his demand then is extreme. Right? He demands for all male children, 2 and under, to be killed in Bethlehem and its vicinity, because he is ruthless in protecting his own authority. And so that's one way that power is abused, is we protect, sometimes violently protect our authority. The second way that we see power abused in our text is by hiding behind our knowledge. And this is seen in the chief priests and the teachers of the law. And this scene is perhaps the most surprising part of it all. If we kind of stepped back, I know it's a familiar story and we've kind of heard it, but if we were trying to watch it with fresh eyes, perhaps the biggest surprise early on is the inactivity of the chief priests and the teachers of the law. Because Herod, once he hears this news from the stranger, he gathers them and he goes, what do the scriptures say about this child that's to be born? And they go, well, the scriptures clearly say this child's to be born in Bethlehem, in Judea. And they have this knowledge, and yet they refuse to act on it. These are people who have literally for their jobs are studying the scriptures. And this moment that they've read about, that they've studied about, this moment that they supposedly had been longing for is now here. And what do? They stay put. Instead, they could have gone with the Magi to see this person that they've been longing to meet. And this is a sign for us that we need to pay attention to, that sometimes we hide behind our knowledge, is that when we have an opportunity to act on our knowledge, we refuse to get involved. If we leave knowledge as knowledge and don't let knowledge lead to action, that's a sign we're hiding behind it. And we see this eventually lead to the scribes and the Pharisees taking steps that we really don't want to take. As we know later in Jesus' story, as Jesus gets older and he does his ministry, it's these same scribes, these same chief priests who now twist scripture not just to keep them away from doing what God's written about, but now they use that same scripture to critique Jesus. They're the same ones who, while Jesus is healing the sick, they go, yeah, but can you do that on the Sabbath? When Jesus is pointing people to the true and living God, they're looking for flaws every step of the way because they're hiding behind their knowledge. Now, this is an example from long ago. What might this look like a little bit more recent history? Well, a great example that I had 9 years ago that I'll share with you today is from the life of President Herbert Hoover. Some of you may know this. Hoover, a decade before he was president, was known as the great humanitarian. And he was known as this because of his work in Belgium after the First World War. Hoover managed to oversee this great enterprise where he had to find and distribute about $1.8 million worth of food every week for 2.5 years. After this time, he had collected and distributed 2.5 million tons of food altogether. And this was to the 8 million Belgians who were on the verge of starvation because during the war, their farms were destroyed and their factories were shut down. And this was, without a doubt, an amazing feat, but Hoover got this great reputation because he made sure everyone knew about it. As one writer put it, he says, 2 things accounted for Hoover's glorious reputation. One is he executed his duties with tireless efficiency and dispatch. And 2, he made sure that no one anywhere was ever unaware of his accomplishments. There was actually another American who did similar work in France after the war, but he didn't get near the credit, near the accolades as Hoover, because Hoover did better PR for himself. Now, there's 2 events in particular in the life of Hoover that kind of show how he started to let power get the best of him. One is he actually didn't ever care to get his hands dirty and to see the work that was happening. Once an aide took him to a field kitchen in Brussels, and shortly after, Hoover told him, "I never want to see this again." A little bit later, there was another time when the Saturday Evening Post wrote a news article. Saturday Evening Post is a newspaper, for those of you who don't know, was a newspaper, wrote a news article, and they suggested that the office in New York should get more credit for the work that was happening in Belgium than Hoover's office that was based in London. Now, Hoover not only corrected them, which is fine, but he then demanded that the New York office run all of their press releases through him in London, because he didn't want his name ever to be tarnished again. And the end result was that it hindered the work of the New York office, who was mainly involved in fundraising. And so their primary work was hindered because Hoover didn't want any hint of his name ever being tarnished for misinformation. So power is often abused by violently guarding our authority and hiding behind our knowledge. Now, one question to ask then is, why do we do this? Well, we do this because we're all desperate for a little bit of control. We all want just a little bit more control than it feels like we currently have. And this has been true of humans from the very beginning. Adam and Eve wanted more control over their lives, so they ate from the tree from the knowledge of good and evil. And this has been the human condition ever since. Pastor Tim Keller writes, "Rather than accept our finitude and dependence on God, we desperately seek ways to assure ourselves that we still have power over our own lives. But this is an illusion." We all have some position of authority in our lives. We have them in obvious places of work or maybe in other community organizations where we serve in. We have positions of authority maybe just in our family or in other relationships. And these positions are necessary. I'm not saying we need to live in a flat, structured society everywhere. But the danger is we often can overly guard this authority because it gives us this sense of control that we desperately long for. That in a world that seems sometimes so out of control, we cling to it. Sometimes we violently guard the little authority that we have because we don't want to lose it. And this need to guard our authority can lead to verbal abuse of others who threaten us. It can lead to us distancing ourselves from others because we don't want anything to threaten the little bit of authority and control that we have. We can also, of course, hide behind knowledge. We can become people who get comfortable criticizing the various actions of those in the world. And this is something we see all the time. Whether it's in kind of flippant things like sports, the Monday morning quarterback, but it's become more serious, where we see it again and again in every area of life. We see it in workplaces of work where it's easy to become the critic. In the world of politics and legislature, it's easy to be the critic. And the danger is we criticize so much that becomes our identity. We simply become critics. And we stop actually being people who participate in the work that needs to be done in the world. In the words of Theodore Roosevelt, he says, "It's not the critic who counts, but it's the one in the arena." And often knowledge can lead us to just being critics instead of informing how we are to act in the arena of our lives in this world. Our only hope for not letting our need for power through authority or knowledge control us is to realize that we are not in control, but instead to embrace that we are in the hands of our Creator and Redeemer. Because Jesus will one day return from Egypt, and after he's grown, he will begin his 3-year ministry, but then there'll be another Roman official who will order him to be killed, and this time he will be crucified. And along the way throughout Jesus' ministry, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, they'll have taken another step. They'll have moved from knowing what they could do and just not participating to moving to this place where they're now going to take their knowledge just to be a critic, and then they're going to take their knowledge and twist these same scriptures that they supposedly love and cherish and use it to sentence Jesus to death. And Jesus goes to his death by not guarding his authority, by not hiding behind his knowledge, but by walking as silently as a sheep to slaughter. In the word of Paul that will be later written in Philippians, he writes, "Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross." Jesus, who was in the ultimate position of authority, laid it all aside for our sake. Jesus, who had perfect knowledge of all things, freely gave it all away for the sake of others. It is to him that we turn from our desire for control and power, because to be free from our thirst for power, we must trust the one who's in control. So what might this look like? What practically might this look like to trust Jesus for control, to push against our longing for power through abusing our authority or hiding behind knowledge? Well, first, typically with these type of things, is to do an assessment. Is to assess, well, how am I using my power? But with power, it's not that easy. It's not like anger. It's not like adultery. Like normally you know when you've committed adultery. Normally you know when anger has gotten out of hand. With power, it's harder to assess because power has the tendency to blind us to what we're actually doing. So instead, I want to suggest to you 2 disciplines that hedge against our abuse of power. The first discipline is the discipline of service. Because when we serve, we are intentionally wielding our power for the good of others. When we intentionally lower ourselves to the same level as others that we might serve them, we know that we're not abusing our power. But we have to be careful, because in our world, I'm sure we've all heard this, is leaders are very good at saying, well, I serve by leading. My whole, CEOs and presidents coming, well, I'm here to serve you. Yeah, but you have all the power, all the authority are in you. When I talk about the discipline of service, I mean actually letting go of some of those rights and privileges and doing something that is quote unquote beneath you. The second discipline is stewardship. Now, often when we think of stewardship, we typically think of it with our finances, and that's fine and good. There's nothing wrong with that, but stewardship goes beyond it. We're actually called to steward our knowledge, is to take good use of the knowledge that we've received. And this is a challenge for many of us, particularly if you're like me and you just like to learn, because it's really easy to confuse learning with growing. And this is something that church people sometimes we can get in the habit of doing as well. I've heard many times from people, they go, man, I love those background stories. I love to hear this word in the Greek is this word in the Hebrew is this, or this situation in the historical context is this. And some of that is good and true, right? That's absolutely necessary to sometimes properly understand what a text is saying, what's happening in the context. All of that's good. But sometimes I wonder if we're confusing learning with growing. Because it's really easy to go, man, I am growing from reading this book. I am growing from hearing these sermons. I am growing from this class I'm taking. But learning is not growth. Knowledge that doesn't lead to a changed life, knowledge that doesn't lead to love, knowledge that doesn't lead to action and service isn't growth at all. And so we have to be mindful of what does it actually mean to steward the knowledge that we've received, just in the same way we might steward the finances we receive. How do we use it wisely and for the good of our world? And last, these two disciplines, they mean nothing unless we couple them with worship. Because the truth is without knowledge of the one who is in control, it's impossible to let go of our desire for control. Without knowing the one who has laid down his life and was raised to new life for our sake and for the sake of the whole world, it's impossible to let go of the little bit of control that we have. So as we come this morning to celebrate communion, be mindful that this is what it is. It is us laying down our lives and giving up control and receiving the life from God himself as he's present in this meal. Let me pray for us.